The day I found out an HOA had approved 120 brand new homes on my land was the day I realized just how dangerous entitlement can become when people assume they own something they've never legally touched. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for nearly 12 years I quietly held a massive piece of undeveloped property on the edge of town. I paid the taxes, maintained the boundaries, and ignored the endless rumors about what would eventually be built there. Then a newly elected HOA president, known throughout the county for controlling everything and everyone around her, decided my land was part of her future expansion plan. What happened next was unbelievable. Permits were pushed, builders arrived, roads were carved out, and foundations started appearing across acreage that legally belonged to me. The craziest part? Nobody bothered to verify ownership until it was far too late. Bro, when I first heard the details of this story, I genuinely couldn't believe people could be this reckless. But trust me, the real shock comes when they finally discovered who actually owned the land they had spent millions developing. Ethan Mercer never intended to become the center of a county-wide scandal. In fact, for most of his adult life, he preferred staying invisible. After inheriting nearly 80 acres of land from his grandfather, he treated it as a long-term investment and little more. The property sat just beyond a rapidly growing suburban development where new neighborhoods seemed to appear every year. While surrounding landowners sold to developers and cashed out, Ethan held on to his parcel. He had no urgent need for money, and his grandfather had always believed the land would become far more valuable in the future. For years, that prediction seemed increasingly accurate. New roads were built nearby. Shopping centers opened. Property values climbed steadily. The once quiet area transformed into one of the fastest-growing parts of the county. As the growth continued, one organization gained more influence than anyone expected, the local Homeowners Association. At the center of that HOA was a woman named Denise Holloway. She had earned a reputation for inserting herself into every issue imaginable. Residents complained that she treated neighborhood meetings like personal kingdoms and acted as though every nearby property existed under her authority. Most people rolled their eyes and tolerated her because fighting with her was exhausting. But Denise's confidence kept growing every year. Eventually, the HOA board unveiled what they called a visionary expansion plan. Their existing community was reaching capacity, and they wanted to create an entirely new section filled with additional homes, parks, walking trails, and recreational facilities. On paper, it looked ambitious. The problem was that much of the proposed expansion sat directly on Ethan's land. What makes this part unbelievable is how many people apparently assumed ownership without checking facts. Somewhere along the way, rumors spread that the vacant acreage had been abandoned or tied up in old estate paperwork. Those assumptions slowly evolved into accepted truths among local decision-makers. Instead of verifying ownership records, people repeated what they had heard from others. Ethan knew none of this was happening. At the time, he was living several states away, managing a successful logistics company and rarely visiting the property. He still paid taxes, maintained insurance, and kept all ownership documentation current, but there was little reason for him to drive out and inspect undeveloped land every few weeks. As far as he knew, everything was normal. Meanwhile, the HOA's expansion project accelerated. Survey crews appeared. Engineers drafted plans. Consultants produced reports. Meetings were held. Contractors submitted bids. Somehow, every stage moved forward without anyone raising the obvious question that should have stopped the entire project before it started. Then construction began. Roads were graded into the landscape. Utility lines were installed. Drainage systems were dug. Concrete foundations appeared across land that legally belonged to Ethan Mercer. Millions of dollars flowed into the project as workers transformed open acreage into the framework of a massive residential development. And still, nobody contacted the actual owner. Months later, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from an acquaintance who happened to drive through the area. The caller casually mentioned seeing heavy construction equipment operating on what he believed was Ethan's property. At first, Ethan laughed it off. Then photos arrived. The moment he opened those images, everything changed. Because staring back at him were paved roads, construction crews, and dozens of partially completed homes sitting directly on land that belonged to him, and the people building them had absolutely no idea they had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. The moment Ethan finished reviewing the photographs, he expected the situation to be resolved within days. Surely someone had made a clerical error. Surely the developers would discover the mistake, apologize, and halt construction immediately. But the deeper he investigated, the more unbelievable the situation became. Public records confirmed what he already knew. The land was still legally his. The taxes had been paid every year. The title was clean. There were no disputes, liens, or ownership questions. On paper, the case seemed incredibly straightforward. Yet when Ethan began contacting the companies involved, he encountered something completely unexpected. For nobody wanted to stop. Millions of dollars had already been invested. Entire streets had been completed. Utility infrastructure stretched across the property. Several model homes were nearly finished. Too many people had become financially committed to the project, and admitting a mistake would trigger a disaster. Instead of acknowledging reality, various parties began convincing themselves the ownership issue would somehow disappear. Bro, this is the exact moment where normal people would slam the brakes and start damage control. Instead, everyone doubled down. The HOA leadership continued promoting the expansion as if nothing was wrong. Marketing materials circulated throughout the county. Future homeowners placed deposits. Builders scheduled additional construction phases. The momentum became so massive that nobody wanted to be the person responsible for stopping it. Ethan, however, wasn't interested in arguments or emotional confrontations. He hired one of the most experienced real estate attorneys in the region and quietly began documenting everything. Every permit, every construction phase, every public statement, every financial investment connected to the development was carefully recorded. What shocked his legal team most was how many warnings had apparently been ignored. During their investigation, they uncovered scattered concerns from surveyors, contractors, and local officials who had questioned property boundaries months earlier. Each concern had been brushed aside. Each warning had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a serious legal issue. And construction kept advancing. By the time legal notices began reaching the responsible parties, dozens of homes were already standing. Framing crews worked daily. Roofing companies moved in. Landscaping plans were approved. The project looked less like a construction site and more like an emerging neighborhood. That's when Ethan made a decision nobody expected. Instead of rushing into court seeking an immediate injunction, he remained patient. His attorneys were confused at first. Friends thought he was crazy. But Ethan understood something important: every additional dollar invested into the project increased the consequences of the mistake. Every finished driveway, every completed home, and every new buyer entering the development only strengthened his position. I genuinely couldn't believe what happened next. Most people would have tried stopping construction immediately. Ethan chose the exact opposite strategy. He simply watched. And while the HOA celebrated what they believed was their greatest achievement, the clock was quietly ticking toward a reckoning that would shake the entire community. By the time the development reached its final stages, the scale of the mistake had become staggering. More than 100 homes stood across Ethan Mercer's property. Fresh pavement connected neatly arranged streets. Decorative entrance signs welcomed future residents. Parks had been landscaped. Streetlights lined the roads. To anyone driving past, it looked like a thriving new community preparing for its grand opening. What nobody realized was that the entire project was standing on land the developers did not own. For months, Ethan had remained almost completely silent. His legal team continued gathering evidence while construction costs climbed higher and higher. Every completed structure increased the financial exposure of everyone involved. Developers assumed the ownership dispute would eventually be settled with a routine payment. HOA leaders convinced themselves that Ethan would accept a quick deal and move on. They could not have been more wrong. The turning point arrived just weeks before the first scheduled closings. Buyers were preparing paperwork. Lenders were finalizing approvals. Moving companies were being booked. Everything appeared ready for celebration. Then Ethan's attorneys made their move. 6 formal legal filings landed across multiple desks simultaneously. Developers received notices. Financial institutions received notices. County officials received notices. The HOA received notices. The documents contained overwhelming evidence proving Ethan's ownership and outlining years of ignored warnings, procedural failures, and unauthorized development. Panic spread almost immediately. Construction meetings turned into emergency meetings. Executives who had been confidently discussing sales projections suddenly found themselves discussing liability. Consultants scrambled to review records. Lawyers were hired by the hour. Phone calls flew in every direction as people tried to understand how such a massive project could have advanced without resolving the most basic question of ownership. Bro, this part absolutely blew my mind. The HOA president who had spent years acting like she controlled everything suddenly faced a reality she couldn't manage through confidence or pressure. The facts were documented. The records were public. The ownership trail was crystal clear. There was no technicality waiting to save anyone. Then came Ethan's ultimate leverage. Rather than accepting a rushed settlement, he demanded negotiations based on the current value of the developed property, not the value of the vacant land before construction began. That single distinction changed everything. Instead of discussing a modest land purchase, the conversation shifted toward losses worth many millions. The developers knew the danger. If the matter continued through prolonged litigation, uncertainty could freeze sales, trigger lender concerns, and create endless financial complications. Every week of delay increased costs. Every headline damaged reputations. Suddenly, the same people who had ignored Ethan for months desperately needed his cooperation. 7. The negotiations stretched on under enormous pressure. Behind closed doors, everyone understood the truth: Ethan held the strongest position in the room. The roads, utilities, homes, and infrastructure had transformed his property into something vastly more valuable than anyone had imagined. The people who had treated ownership as an afterthought had accidentally handed him extraordinary leverage. And after all the arrogance, assumptions, and ignored warnings, the HOA leadership finally found themselves facing consequences they could neither control nor escape. In the end, a massive settlement was reached. Ethan received compensation far beyond the original value of the vacant land, while developers absorbed enormous losses. The HOA leadership faced investigations, resignations, and public backlash. The neighborhood survived, but the people responsible never escaped the consequences of assuming ownership mattered less than ambition. Looking back, this story proves that arrogance can be expensive, but patience can be priceless. Bro, I genuinely couldn't believe how many people ignored basic ownership records until reality caught up with them. Karma doesn't always arrive quickly, but when it does, it hits hard. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Have you ever seen entitlement backfire this badly?